Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. Thanks so much for spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it. And if you have time, check out the YouTube channel. That's Barbara DeLong. And check out the other shows that we've done. They are absolutely as fascinating as tonight's show is. And if you enjoy what you listen to, please be kind and subscribe to us. I want to thank Ken Quiet Hawk for his amazing intro. You can discover him at nativestorytellers.com. He and his wife are native storytellers, and they have amazing material on their website and sort of a hint into how history and cosmology were preserved before the written word, and it's something everybody should experience. It's really quite fascinating and educational and enlightening and entertaining as well. Tonight's show, Mark has a fascinating guest, and I can't wait to listen to the two of them. So welcome, Mark, to the show.
Hey, Barbara, how are you?
Doing well. Doing very well, actually.
I think winter's here.
I'm afraid you're right.
Yeah. But, we're heading to the southern hemisphere, like metaphorically speaking, tonight. So hopefully that will warm everyone up as we have our first blast of winter. And also wanted to remind the listeners we're working on rescheduling Graham Phillips from yesterday. He came down with a cold, and this wasn't a good time to do an interview, but we're going to get him rescheduled. We have tonight's show, obviously, and Mary tomorrow night, 9 to 10, right?
Right.
Okay. So at least the listeners will get 2 out of the 3 shows this week. So we have another guest making her debut tonight and introducing us to a fascinating and underreported topic, ancient canals of the Americas. Joan Conover is one of my colleagues at Ancient American Magazine. Joan was a speaker at last month's AAPS Conference. Joan is an avid sailor on her 51-foot sailboat and is a satellite engineer, and we're going to learn a whole lot more about her research over the next couple hours. So welcome, Joan. How are you?
Oh, I am fine. I'm really privileged to be able to talk on your program and share some of the research and really the interesting agricultural canals and systems that are found in the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are going to get to all that and a whole lot more in a little bit. But we had you scheduled for like a month, 5 weeks ago. You were to be the concluding guest for our trilogy to promote the AAPS Conference, and Blog Talk had a little tech issue that week, and so we unfortunately did not have you on prior to the conference, but you're on with us tonight.
Well, can I share something about the conference with you?
Oh, sure. That's what I was leading up. And Judy said how much that she appreciated, the publicity we did for this year's conference. So, you were there, so give us a little bit more background of what was going on for that weekend.
Well, we had blocks of speakers, and I was very impressed with the variety and the research that had been done. There were some very professional presentations. One of the presenters had done quite a bit of research on DNA, showing where different groups of humans had moved through the different parts of the world at certain times, which kind of highlight a little bit on some of the work that I've been doing, because we're always putting pieces of puzzles together. And I think that the conference provided some puzzle pieces, not all of them, but wonderful presentations. Jay Wakefield was there. We had just an amazing group of professionals that were all, outlining their theories. They shared their research. It was just, for me, a first time, and it was stunning, just stunning. I know that Judy has shared quite a bit with you all. I'm assuming she's probably spoken on the program, but some of the areas that we explored hadn't probably been explored before. And I know that there was a very good representation from people from California, people from Louisiana, people from northern part of the United States, from Connecticut, from Virginia, from Florida. It was just a real excellent group of researchers. We were researchers.
And you mentioned that there were a lot of very professional presentations. I'm sure Lon had a lot of PowerPoint
yes.
photos of his ancient garden beds. He's a very detailed researcher. But you just brought up information like the presentations dealt with some of the DNA that can lead into migrations. We had a big like 2 or 3 part series about a month ago with Andrew Collins and Greg Little talking about the Denisovans and their migrations around the world. That's actually becoming a pretty big topic now. And one of the points I wanted to make is, with research, like the high-tech research that's being presented at conferences like AAPS, people like Rick Osman focusing on like the Wabash River Valley, with some of the ancient peoples, how they were utilizing the valley. It sounds like AAPS and similar conferences are moving away from the just like unsubstantiated claims to places that you can actually visit, and after you're done, like go home, get do your like Google Earth calculations, and it's more fact based instead of theory. Are you seeing that kind of trend emerging from these conferences?
I'm seeing more scientific writing, more research, and better presentations. Lon was wonderful with his gardens. That the gardens that were prehistory gardens, pre-Columbus gardens, the growing beds that were up in the Michigan areas, where he has been mapping them out and looking at how they cropped their land and whatnot. And then you had Rick showing the transportation networks that came down the Mississippi, even finding a boat and talking about how those boats could have portaged. We all have we know that there was a copper trade from Michigan. There's 500,000 tons of missing copper from Michigan. No one knows where it went to. No one knows how it got to where it went to. But to actually support, it took food. Well, there's your gardens. It took a transportation network. There's Rick with portaging with these boats, proving that these wooden boats that they could cart over land could carry things. You have evidence of some very unusual artifacts that tie maybe the Caribbean area up into the Michigan area. All of that was discussed during this conference, and we could sit down and talk with each other and kind of share some of the research we haven't written about yet, or we're just looking at, but we don't know that it's something to write about. It's you're working on the validity, because you don't want to put something out in writing unless you can really prove it. That's my theory, and what I hope all of us do, and I think we do. So to sit down with these different areas, I mean, the gardens that were up in Michigan that were the prehistory, the raised bed gardens. Well, there's a bunch of raised bed gardens that are amazing down in South America, and they're 12,000 foot in the air. The transportation networks, there's canals down in the lower Mississippi Delta, and I talked about those, that looked like major trade center canals. Those are very difficult to determine when they were made, if they were repurposed, if they were made by in modern times, which is after Columbus, if it was made before Columbus, because of all of the mining and the oil companies and everything that's been done down in the Louisiana areas and the delta of the Mississippi, which has been pretty darn destructive. But we've been able to map out some pieces that show, yep, there probably was some sort of trade network docks, pretty good-sized docks, 200 or 300 foot wide docks. There were salt domes. There were mounds with pottery. They made pottery. They didn't make anything else but pottery in those mounds, right next to the salt domes, which is very important for trade, because those were the plastic bags of that era, or those thousands of years. That was pottery. Those were plastic bags.
Right.
That's how you carried stuff. So all these little pieces, you kind of put them together, and you're sitting there and talking to the other folks, and you're saying, well, my piece goes here. And eventually, more of the pieces of the puzzle come together. And eventually, maybe researchers and universities pick up more of the pieces. Although we're using a lot of research from the universities when we go find it, and find, hey, they already talked about that. They already knew that, but somebody put it away and forgot about it. So there's a lot of pieces that all of us are trying to put together. And I really like this conference. This was a real opportunity. And it'll be posted on, I'm sure, the AAPS site, some of the briefings, and be shared with the public.
And when I was talking with Judy earlier today, told her, okay, we got Joan coming on tonight, and she was all excited, and they already have October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th booked for 2020 at the Harris Island Casino in Michigan. So I know it's 11 months away, but Judy's already working on next year's conference. So it sounds like with the attendance increasing again this year, that this is going to be a annual fall event. So just put that on your calendars for next year. And Joan, you just mentioned that you're getting a lot of your information from university publications and what their anthropology and archaeology teams are discovering. But when we get into looking at what you're researching, you're also using satellite imagery. Let's look at that as just introduce the listeners to where you're getting your information, what the satellite images reveal, and we'll keep building on the information you provide us. So, what are you finding?
Well, my profession for years was working with either terrain or satellite imagery or processing, computer processing for understanding terrain, the physics behind terrain, for modeling and simulation, that kind of thing. And you really have to, you have to know what that terrain is pixel by pixel when you're doing something like that. Now, I started, the research that I'm doing right now started, I'd say about 15 years ago, but I really started writing probably about 10 years ago, because it took me years to read and research to the point where I felt that I had something to say. I got drug in it kind of backwards, because I started with old maps, loved old maps. And I started reading Hapgood's work on maps of the Sea Kings, Cremo's work, many other researches from different universities talking about these old maps and stuff. And I bumped into maps like the Piri Reis Map, and I bumped into Kirshner's and Happel's. I found an old map that was miscatalogued in NOAA that was from 1630, and it was for Gulf Stream currents. I'm a sailor. I was interested in Gulf Stream currents. I don't remember exactly how I looked at that particular map, but looking at it, I suddenly realized there was something wrong with that map, because it was almost perfect. Perfect lat long, had the ice sheets in North America were there. The South America was perfect. North America was perfect, but it didn't have currents, Gulf Stream currents, but it sure looked like it might have some sort of trading route. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, these routes that are circular in these different oceans, and it showed the world. So I went and looked at one spot, and that was the Mississippi Delta, and I found canals there in the satellite imagery, because I couldn't figure out how else to look at something. So you go look at your imagery, and you go back through the history of the imagery, and you can pull stuff. You can find LIDAR, which is kind of a flyover that radar that processes the terrain so that you can see details, and it kind of removes the vegetation so you can see the lumps and everything. I'm sure that people have heard about the finds down in the Central America, the Mayan ruins and stuff that are just, I mean, everyone's finding something down there. I mean, lost cities and everything else in Central America from the Mayan civilization, and they are finding those with LIDAR. There's wonderful LIDAR of the southern part of the United States, which is free to look at. So I looked at some of that stuff, and I found these canals, but I couldn't determine if they were new or old. I mean, it took a lot more research and a lot of reading of some theses in some of the universities to come up and define which was what kind of thing that I was looking at. So I thought, well, that's a little bit hard. So then I went down to South America, and it was in South America that I found these tremendous canals, circular canals, some of them fantastic circular canals, 12 to 15,000 foot in the air, where you're not supposed to be able to grow anything, in a totally deserted area. And a disaster, really is a disaster zone. But so I find these wonderful canals. Some of them are as big a diameter as the Great Pyramid is tall. These are huge canals. There's about 8, 10, or 15 of them all around the Altiplano, Lake Titicaca in Peru. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I started looking around to see if anybody found anything about that. Nope. No sign of that. I thought, well, that's really interesting. So then I went and talked with Jay Wakefield, who said, well, yep, there's a prehistory stuff here, and he sent me all his books, and I read his Rocks and Rose, and I read about the copper trade, and I thought, well, that's a civilization. Maybe that had something to do with the Mississippi Delta, but I didn't know what it had to do with South America. So I thought, well, maybe I'll look at the place where there was another place in South America where these currents went to, and there I found another transportation network. So that kind of made me start really researching. So I've been mapping South America, the canals, been mapping in the Mississippi Delta, the canals, and I've been writing and publishing in Ancient America several articles on the Piri Reis Map and on the findings of the canals both in South America and North America. And I've been working with research done by Raphael Eisman, who's done some wonderful work down there in Chile, where he has actually been going up into the mountains and going up into by the volcano, where he's found some just probably megalithic places that haven't been explored yet. He's gone down the Amazon. And then you have Brian Forrester, who's done wonderful, wonderful presentations on YouTube of his trips to look at the different areas and the damage or the megalithic buildings, the civilization that was there, and trying to get people's attention to pay attention, to take a look at what is there. And it's just a mystery. And that's wonderful stuff to write about. It's just, it's amazing. There are about over 250,000 acres of identified raised growing beds in just the Altiplano of Peru alone. That's on the west side of South America. And the man-hour labor to build these things, unbelievable. And just 258,000 acres is just a drop in the bucket, because every single mountain down there looks like it may have a foundation on it. It's just been burned off. So it's a very interesting place to look at. It hasn't been touched. It hasn't been explored that much. Brian, bless him for going there and struggling as he's been doing to get the story out from there, and Raphael the same way. They have just done excellent work down there.
Joan, I just want to say that a lot of the areas that you're talking about where these canals are located is not in the river valley next to the Amazon River. We're talking like really high elevations.
Right.
That makes it even more of a
unusual.
captivating subject. Yeah, right. And you did mention something about the agricultural practices at such a high altitude. That deserves some insight. What is going on with the high altitude agricultural?
What they did with these raised beds, they had raised beds much like Lund's beds up in Michigan, but they ran water in amongst these beds, and they were not tremendously deep, but they were deep enough to allow evaporation of the water into the air. They actually made it like a giant, almost like a greenhouse, and it could modify these, what they call camelones or soloculas, these raised growing beds. They raised plants in the raised dirt part of the bed. They had water in between, and they raised fish, small fish in the water, and they would grow two or three crops through the most horrendous growing conditions that high in the altitude. They terraced the sides of the mountains, and the terracing is not just simply put in these bricks and stones and stuff. They are actually designed, and we just now, modern agriculture understands how to build a terrace that is similar to the way that these prehistory terraces were built, because they were built with a perfect angle to catch the sun and to grow plants as you went up this mountain. And they collected water. They brought the water down. They stored water in these huge aquifers. Same way that the Mayans did. The Mayans used aquifers to store their water. This civilization, or this group of people, and there were millions of them. There had to be, from the amount of raised beds that they had. They were able to store water and pump water up, pull water from the mountains. They had big canals leading from the Andes down into the lake areas, and it was a very wet, marshy environment. And that would have been approximately about 12,000 years ago. There were two episodes of these agricultural efforts. One was when there was a lot of water, and they had large circular water management systems, these huge, huge circular, looks like almost a constellation of these circles. And that could be, it's possible it could be they made these geoglyphs. It's called geoglyphs, are the raised beds, but they made them in images. And you can see horses, you can see people, you're looking down these giant people that you can only see from the sky, animals, scripts. We don't know what the scripts are. We know what the animals are. We can tell what they are. We can tell the people are kneeling and praying, and their hands are up, and they have elongated heads. And you see that in the canals. They built the canals that way. Beautiful, beautiful images. Absolutely fantastic. They had a lot of water. And then something happened. There was a tremendous flood. There was a covering of about 9 meters of red clay over all of this stuff. And their aquifers were destroyed, it looks like, by earthquakes or something. But however they managed their water, that system got destroyed, so they designed a new one. So that's on top of the old one. But you can find layers of these old systems underneath the newer systems, which are still maybe 14,000 years ago that they were built. And you have to think, how long did it take someone to learn how to do that? So if you back it out to say it happened, it's very, very old. Well, it took a long time for them to figure out how to do that, and there were a lot of people there. There's an interesting book that was written by the USDA in the 1800s. They went to Japan and China, and only bean counters in the USDA would do this. They wrote a book about how many people you can feed with the Chinese canals and the Japanese canals, which were very sophisticated and very manpower intensive, but it fed a huge population with raised growing beds and canals. And they were able to count how many thousand people could be fed over how many square feet of land. And by taking that and just kind of templating it for the raised growing beds seen in the Alto Plano, and then looking at the number of crops they possibly could have gotten from this enhanced agriculture. And oh, by the way, they developed some amazing crops to raise that high. Quinoa is a perfect human food. If you just ate quinoa, you would be perfectly fed, which is unusual because that is really pigweed. If you brought that plant back down to a lower level to sea level, well, it will breed with pigweed and becomes pigweed. Amaranth, the same thing. Amaranth that they grow at the higher altitudes, you bring it to a lower altitude and it crosses over with other weeds, what we call weeds here at the lower altitudes, and the qualities are lost. So somebody engineered something, I believe, with some of these plants that they grew at these high altitudes. Quinoa only grows at high altitudes. The amaranth only grows at that high altitude. It grows down below, yeah, but not like it grows and provides food at that high altitude. Potatoes, same thing. Tomatoes, the same thing. So there was a lot of agriculture. There was a tremendous amount of engineering to put all everything together, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful environment. And that was destroyed very violently, I believe. At least the evidence is there. But we have in the Alto Plano, you have from Colombia at the north, you have all of these ancient raised beds. You can see evidence of them. You have megalithic systems there too. You have all along the western side of South America to Chile, all the way down to Argentina, you have these remnants of these canal systems, and it could be foundations. It's hard to tell because they're very old, but they're square. They're over everything. They're terraced over everything. There were an amazing high number of people, millions, could have lived there and been fed with the way they had their agriculture set up. Which leads back to an interesting question. Where was if you had this amount of people, where did they get fed from if they ate meat or salt? They needed salt for production and stuff. Did we have a big civilization that covered some of the Americas? And then you find on the east coast in Brazil and the Amazon rainforest, you find the evidence of canals there and in Suriname. And this is in the Nani Swamp, the part of the Amazon. You find long zigzag, and they're 5 miles one way with a 45 to 15 degree angle, 5 miles the other way, up and down, 200 feet wide. Absolutely flat. They flattened the current in the river so that they could put, I believe, traffic of some sort. Maybe those flat rafts could carry things up and down through this area, and it's cut off the current of the Amazon. So you had something going on the east coast of South America. You had something going on in Rio de Janeiro because there are some interesting water collection raised growing beds down there that are still working underneath the existing farming areas. And all of this is just pointing out that there was something significant in the Americas, that it wasn't just a few people living as hunter-gatherers when Columbus arrived, which is the story we're all told.
And I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but is there any kind of connection between Lon Krieger's Michigan-raised vegetable beds or garden beds and the ones in South America? Is there similar plants, similar designs to the garden? It's like I was trying to establish. Was there? Could these canals? Canals show some kind of trade network going on between
I think there was a trade network. I think we had a series of trade networks. I think we've had a series of disasters that damaged trade networks. But when you look at these absolutely unexplored, unknown canals that are up, there's been some research done in Bolivia, in the Beni region of those canal areas where they tried to bring some back, and they found out it took too much work to bring them back. It just takes a lot of man-hours to do those kind of canals and, raise the bed up and take care of them and all that. It was just something that was difficult to do. But they did research it and figured out how it could be productive. But then you had the Mayans, who also had a tremendous agricultural canal system. And then you had in Mexico, you had the Aztecs that had a tremendous canal system. They actually had floating gardens. And then you go up into Arizona and New Mexico, and you had the Anastasi up in that area that had migrated there. It looks like people migrated and different things happened. Disasters happened. They migrated here, they migrated there. You probably had a group that migrated up the Mississippi, or maybe from the eastern U.S. It looks like they probably came from the northern part of Europe into the northern U.S. That brought their own ways of doing things. But these growing beds, these raised beds, while they don't have the same crops up in Michigan that they had in South America simply because of the altitude, at least in the Altiplano, and I don't know what crops they would have raised in the Amazon areas, although I suspect probably some of the tobacco and some of the cocaine-type plants might have been a very popular thing just because of the religious beliefs of the Americans. And by saying Americans, I mean prehistory Americans, because they use that in a lot of their ceremonies and stuff. But the corn came later, I believe, than some of this stuff. And corn, squash, beans, those were the foods of the Mayans, the Aztecs. The Anastasi raised those. They had wonderful growing beds and canals. And then in the central United States, I think with the mound builders, it was a tremendous agricultural system there, although people haven't really talked about that much as how they knew they must have done something. It's just they don't know where or how they did it. It's a great shame that people don't take a deeper look at some of the satellite imagery and go find things that resemble, because you can find a lot of similarities in some of the canal techniques in, say, South America that you can find in some pieces of other places in the Americas to the north.
And when Barbara gets the YouTube archive tomorrow, a few samples of the aerial photography will be on, will rotate on the archive. But the samples that you sent to us do look almost like some of the crop circle patterns.
They do. They look exactly like the crop circle patterns, but they are actually water management canals. And they're beautiful. I mean, you have concentric circles, again, as big as the height of the Great Pyramid. One of the circles, there's joined circles. There's these huge, great, and they grew crops and had water running in it. Why they did that? I mean, it would have been much easier not to make great, big, beautiful pictures. I mean, just to do that, they had to, the land there is karst. It's like, it's lake bed. It's limestone. And so they built on top of that. They built and made dirt and built up the sides of this dirt and made planting areas. I mean, it's a genius. They made, it's called black earth there. That's kind of a bacteria that is in the soil that makes it super fertile. They made that. How did they know to do that? And these beautiful circles, I mean, absolutely, like flowers, like, patterns. There's woven, like, leaves on the ground. I mean, but these are huge. I mean, they're hundreds and hundreds of feet wide, 600-700 foot wide, and going for miles and miles and miles across this old lake bed. And this lake bed, it used to be a beautiful marsh area. I think most of the Altiplano was at one time. It was a sea that raised up slowly through the generations, and it was still salt briny now. But something caused it to collapse on one end, and it actually dropped about 1,000 foot, and all that flooding destroyed or covered up a lot of the agricultural areas, and just cracked the aquifers they were using for water storage. I mean, it's just a real lesson learned for anyone who looks at a single point of failure for a civilization. If you depend on your aquifers and your aquifers get broken and you don't have water and you use that water for your crops and to change the environment and everything, you're gone. And that happened to them. It was a very traumatic time. It must have been a tremendous upheaval to cause that kind of damage and to look like 9.0 earthquakes to shake up everything like that. Pretty bad.
Yeah, and okay, before we get into some type of cataclysmic event, Lon has his Michigan garden beds, maybe 3,000-4,000 years ago,
right.
And coming closer to modern times. Do we have a some type of date for when the South American canals and all these terrace gardens were built?
I think we can say about when they were destroyed.
Okay.
And that would have been probably at the end of the Pleistocene, during the Quaternary extinction. Because we know that there were, underneath this red flooded clay, which is about the time that this happened, that it knocked down, that there's destroyed buildings down there, these huge blocks of buildings that are just thrown like somebody's toys, and then covered up with this red clay. Brian Forrester has kindly offered some of his images, and you just look at this, and there's a mixture of human remains and stuff underneath some of that clay. They found bodies in some of the areas where they were taking the restoring the buildings. They would find these, I guess, the priests for the some of the temples at Pumapunku and stuff, that they actually found some bodies there, which was evident. But I don't know that anyone's ever looked at the ages of the remains underneath the red clay. So we probably know about when this flooded, but we don't know when it started.
Okay,
and I
so
think
it was what prior to the end of the Pleistocene period was like 13,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. So the terraces and canals were built prior.
I think prior. Again, this is you're kind of going out on a limb, a big limb on this, because you can look at the Ice Age cores. David Lappy did some wonderful work on that, and tell when there was a lot of moisture. You can tell when, from some of the old maps, the Piri Reis Map, you can tell from that map that there was. It said, and Hapgood thought that it shows South America without ice on it. That would have been mapped then maybe 8,000 years ago.
Okay.
So, I mean, we're talking back there in time. Mm-hmm. The Piri Reis Map shows canals in eastern Brazil that were misinterpreted, I think, as the Andes Mountains. They aren't. You can go in there and you can find the canals right where it says, where the Piri Reis where everyone thought it was supposed to be the Andes. But the timing of when this started, I don't know. I think you can pretty well tell when it ended. And no one knows who these people were. I think that the Spaniards didn't find anybody up there. I mean, they found the Incas were there. The Incas, I think, picked up what was already there, because certainly the amount of terraces on these mountains and stuff, the number of people to build those terraces that high up, all over from Colombia all the way down to, like one researcher said, there was a lot of people over a really long time. Just a lot of people over a really long time. And you found the Inca civilizations, you found the Nazca, you found the Paracas, you found a lot of different warring groups that were, not maybe at the civilization level that the Spaniards were when they showed up. Of course, they had horses and guns. But the people that build this stuff, I don't think were the same as the Incas. Didn't build with great big stones. They built with smaller stones. And so the remnants that we see, no one else, I've never seen anybody build anything like these canals anywhere since those canals were abandoned.
Okay, so we have a date when this civilization received a striking blow. What was the cause of this catastrophe?
They've been doing a lot of research on, they found that there's now this, they know that in North America that the end of the Ice Age was rather catastrophic. They don't talk much about South American catastrophic events that caused the damage down there. But I think that it probably was something similar, something solar. There was they found the big meteor strike up in Iceland, which is significantly large. They found, that the ice sheets melted very suddenly. It was big flooding. I think a similar thing might have happened down in South America. There are some interesting Indian, I won't say Indian, Carib stories about, they call it a snake dance, but when you draw out what they call a snake, it certainly looks more like two comets running around, because you don't ever have a red-headed, spiky snake with a little tiny skinny tail anywhere in South America. But that's another story. But the stories of, there's pottery showing what looks like a solar flare. They have images of people kneeling, looking to the skies and crying out. You have the little effigies, the little jade effigies. You find those in Mexico and stuff. But you also find the effigies in the ground, those geoglyphs in the canals, the images of people with their hands out in supplication looking to the sky. So I think something happened from the sky. I think solar flare, meteor strike, who knows? But something bad, really bad, happened up in the altiplano and in northern, the North America areas at the end of the Ice Age.
Okay. Barbara, doesn't that sound like Andrew's information about the Younger Dryas period from his Denisovan origin? Yeah, that's and he was on Ancient Aliens, giving a demonstration of there's that one layer that you find all around the world where it's like this ashy layer.
Yeah, there's it's the same for the extinction event for the dinosaurs, where the Chicxulub meteor, the crater in Mexico, it put those little micro beads around the world of that black mat layer. But that was like, I think, 65 million years ago. But the Younger Dryas has something similar to that. I just don't know that. I know that the Topper site and some work that was done by Mr. Firestone, but that was, he was kind of really, that really damaged his career. He didn't follow the party line, I guess. But now people are beginning to think maybe something really did happen that way, and that there was the cause of the Younger Dryas was some sort of meteor strike or something that left a haze or something around the world that shows up in that layer of dirt.
Yeah, and that was interesting to read about that. All those nano diamonds that you just mentioned, found all around the world in that black
mat layer.
The stratigraphy found all around the world. You get all these like little pieces of diamonds, and that just is something really fascinating. To have been a person to live through that would have just been horrifying. And I think Andrew was talking about like the post-traumatic stress disorder that people would have
had from that. I think we still have it. But the damage was particularly interesting in some areas of South America because, when you're researching stuff, you go back and you read everything. Well, you go and read Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle because he's the first one who went around South America. You read what he talks about of finding these large skulls in the tuff. That's kind of like limestone residue of lifted land or something, but it's not really old, but it's not like yesterday. Finding these skulls and people in the remnants underneath soil. He found bones of humans mixed up with megafauna, large animals, mixed up underneath the some of the areas in the pampas underneath the red clay, and then had some really other good comments from his journals. But I don't know how. Then it was considered scientific. Now that isn't considered his writing. and the way he reported wouldn't be considered scientific because we don't have, DNA samples. We don't have the metrics and all that. He wrote about what he saw, and they want photographs. They want it measured. They want the site dissected and everything. And he didn't actually do that, but he had a very interesting few comments if you looked at what he talked about. That he saw in the land where it's raised up in some places from either earthquakes or from tsunamis, from floods. So on both sides of South America, he made some very interesting discoveries as you read that. And then you continue reading on other discoverers or explorers and journals and everything else. So you start building a story that you write on. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. I'm looking at the agricultural pieces of it, looking at how many people could have fed this kind of agriculture, both there in South America and even up in the Michigan area, because that same kind of agriculture would have changed the environment if they had enough of it. With raised water in the beds and stuff, it would keep the climate 10 degrees or 5 degrees warmer, or could. So it's just fascinating to look at this stuff, read about the history of things, go look at what the satellite imagery of the ground actually shows you, and see if there is a relationship for all the other pieces that other people are finding. It's just kind of it's a puzzle piece putting together, and it's fun.
And Raphael
Eisman, yeah.
Eisman has written several articles pertaining to this cataclysmic event, and he does talk about there were some like Adam type people in the Aztec mythology, probably
yes.
more Noah-like, with like the one guy that survives on a ship and arrives. It sounds just like the Middle Eastern Noah, and you get this basically the
there
same story.
There are many similar stories. Many
all
similar
around
stories.
the world. Yeah. And on your research and reading all these journals, are you finding that it's not just the Old Testament biblical account of the flood? That's not just the only one. We have it in Native American traditions and South American mythology.
South American Inca tradition.
Incas.
You go back to almost any culture that has. Usually, it's oral history, and that's another problem. That oral history isn't recognized as being scientific. But if you don't have paper to write on, you can chip on stones, but that's not really very rapid. So the oral histories are extremely important in a lot of these ancient civilizations. The Incas, the Hindu, the Chinese. The Chinese were writing, but before that they had the oral histories. You had the North American peoples. You have almost every single civilization has a story of a flood, a Noah-type figure, people hiding in caves or in boats, and ending up on a mountain somewhere, and being told ahead of time there was going to be something bad happening, and to be prepared. It's just not. It's a universal story. It isn't just a biblical story. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and you get the legend that Noah's Ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, and in your friend Raphael's writings, he's talking about after this cataclysm in South America, you get the guy showing up.
Villahosha, he came on
the boat
on a boat
near mountains too.
You have the story of the West Coast Indian groups who came on ships and ended up on mountains from floods.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like especially in the Washington, Oregon areas. There's a lot of the Amerindian groups there have those stories of their elders came in boats and landed on the mountains. You have this in South America. Now, Raphael, he has the most interesting site where it's a mountain, but but it's not one where I would think that a Noah figure would have gone to. But they sure picked a spot that wasn't the world's best spot for building a patio and maybe some sort of mound or pyramid, because it's on the edge of a volcano that blew up. And so he's been up there with these bricks and rocks and stuff of these megalithic structures, trying to piece together what happened there and figure out how to prove on the side of a volcano what this was. And very, very interesting site. He's gone up there several times, and I think this time he's taken up drones and stuff to look at it. I don't know when he'll be writing about that, but all of these different groups, the stories from the Inca of their hero god that saved everybody and showed them how to do things, and came on a ship. Very smart person, brought them out of the caves or saved them. Many, many stories like that are just everywhere around the world.
Okay, and it sounds like that, from the several comments you made that this was just a utter devastation to South America. Do we have evidence of the few people who are left migrating?
Well, there is some migration evidence. Now, the Carib Indians migrated from the Amazon area. They went up through the Windward-Leeward Islands, and they may have become the Taino Indians that were found when Columbus arrived in Puerto Rico and San Salvador and whatnot. The Caribs themselves were a very interesting group. We were down in Dominica, which is one of the islands almost to Venezuela, between Venezuela and, say, Puerto Rico halfway. There's this island called Dominica, and they do have the what's left of a group of Carib Indians. There's actually a reservation there, and they do the same dances and serve the same drinks as the Carib Indians did in ceremonies documented in the Amazon areas back in the 1800s. So that's very interesting. They found gold fragments up in St. John's in the Virgin Islands that probably had to have come from South America, from someone who knew how to work gold, because it was very, very thin sheets, very tiny pieces, thin sheets, but a special alloy, and it had was electroplated as well. And that's something they found in middens from prehistory or pre-Columbus middens from the Taino Indian areas of St. John's Island. So that shows maybe a migration. Now, it could have come from, it's possible they came from the opposite way, but the Caribs actually came from the Amazon areas to the north. I would also think a natural migration path would be up the Panama, up through Mexico, up to the United States. And don't forget, we have evidence of these big rafts. And, it's been proven those big old reed rafts can go many, many places across the ocean. The Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, that is it's not easy to sail it unless you know the water and the waves, but the currents take you from South America, wrap you around Mexico, and they take you straight up towards the Mississippi Delta, and then they take you out around Florida, out past the Bahamas, and then north to Europe. And it's 2 or 3 knots current. It's not just a little bit of current, it's quite a bit of it. So there's a natural path, and I would think that the whole area I think that there was a lot of sharing of communications and a lot of migration that went either by sea or went by land, depending on what had happened disaster-wise with either volcanoes or, solar events or drought or flooding. Because people evidently survived somehow.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is very interesting. When we were doing a show a few months ago on the Book of Mormon, we covered some of the information in the book that seems pretty accurate, discussing the migrations of people from South America to North America, and eventually get some of the copper plates that were found across America, and like the more famous ones were the ones found in the Hill Cumorah in New York that kind of got the Mormon faith going. But there, what you're talking about just does seem like it's documented in prophecies that were later recorded in the Book of Mormon. It's just interesting, and you're just talking about the Gulf Coast and or the Gulf Stream.
Well, the currents are there, and we're sailing them all the time. They're all over the place.
And we've had a couple guests talk about how do the Egyptian mummies have
tobacco and cocaine
in their system? Yeah. So it seems like there is something happening, like this post-flood, that we do have proof for in just like the mummies and these copper plates that have been discovered in the last couple hundred years?
Well, there are all little tiny pieces out there. There's, they just found, it's about 5 or 10 years ago, I guess, area in South America near where some of these canals are, up in the Altiplano. They found the remnants of a building, and they found indigo dye, and they found woven cotton, Egyptian cotton. But the dye was a better color of indigo dye, and the cotton was a better type of cotton than the best Egyptian cotton that they knew about. So how did you have something that was so was more advanced found in a 9,000-year-old building in South America? How did that get there? It's like out of place, but it was fascinating, and it's documented. It's just nobody talks about it.
Since we're talking about this ancient this flood from deep antiquity,
destructive. Something destroyed stuff, and flood was involved with it. There's probably also a lot of fire involved in it.
I was just
really bad.
It just had to change the atmosphere that really must have made it very difficult to even breathe. But there was around this time. You have some researchers talking about Yonaguni, and the Sphinx was submerged for some time, and that's why you have the water
that's
erosion.
Robert's work on the Sphinx as far as the weathering of the Sphinx, for the age of the Sphinx and the fact that it was weathered with water, which makes it hard for everyone to believe because they can't believe there was that much water in Egypt. Evidently.
Is this all like the same time period?
I would think that because of our oral histories, our stories, the Bible, all of the written and oral histories that we see around the world all talk of the same issue. I don't know if it means we had it happen once. Did we have it happen several times? Is this something that's a cycle that repeats? It's one of the reasons I think that looking at the damage in if we can find these places where it's been damaged and people haven't dug around in it and messed it up too much, where we can look and see what happened and figure out the dates and times, it might be really smart to do that. Because if it's something that happens on a cycle, we'd better figure it out pretty quickly. I think there's some interest in some of the governments now realizing that something happened. They're kind of wondering, looking around, was it a planet? Was it an asteroid? Was it a sun flare, a solar flare? The Earth wobbled, the crust crunched up, they don't know why, and they're a little uncertain about it. There's been signs of some fairly significant tsunamis on some coastlines. What caused those? Again, getting back to Darwin, he talks about the explorers that he talked to who'd found these caves stuck way up on these mountains with human bodies, and one of them was some large human bodies, and they found a whole bunch of saber-toothed cats in the same cave. Now, were those humans and cats living there at the same time? Because those were the megafauna. They found, flood evidence 2,000, 3,000 foot in the air in some of the mountain areas on the eastern side of the Andes. Just looking at just some of the damage areas, and say the altiplano, or even where lava has come up and still left fields marked by the lava, and that was during the Pleistocene, or the Ice Age, or the Younger Dryas period, or the end of the Ice Age and the Younger Dryas period, when those happened, because you can tell from the dates of when that lava was liquid. So there's some dating you can do, but there was some pretty bad damage. There were floods. It may be cyclical. No one knows. But again, I think it might be really smart to figure out what at least in a few places, if we can figure out what happened, because it could happen again.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with you. It's a good point, and if we move much more forward in time from the cataclysm, you do cover the very mysterious Piri Reis Map in your article in Ancient American Magazine in edition 119. This really seems, this map seems like it's one of those out-of-place artifacts. The drawings on this map seem very accurate for
the year, because that was
1513.
1513, and we believe that it was put together from other maps pieced together. They didn't understand about the lat long at that period of time, but the information on many of it, Hapgood did an excellent article on, wrote in his book on Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, how he thinks the Piri Reis map was put together. And it shows South America without ice. It shows pretty good. You can map South America ports and everything. It does show that one area that they seem to think was the Andes, because there is no part. The map is torn off, so it only shows part of South America. So they said, well, it had to be the Andes, because they couldn't figure out what else it was. But when you go look there, you find canals, you find beautiful. It's almost like topographical water collection systems there in that same area. And that's where that long, zigzaggy 100 miles of 5 miles this way, 5 miles that way, 5 miles this way, with very sharp angles. I mean, it's 200 foot wide. It comes and it just makes an absolute, sharp turn to stop the water. I mean, there's 100 miles of that, and it's been destroyed at either end. You can see where the was just ripped apart by something. But there's 100 miles of that in that same area where the Piri Reis map is. Then if you go and look at that same Piri Reis, and you look at how it depicts Africa, and I haven't done anything on that because I'm spending most of my time on the Americas, it does show where on the African part of it, it shows lakes and ports that are known to have been there maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. It shows the Nile River running to the west, or running from the west towards the area of the Nile River runs now, but there was a tributary that came across the Sahara towards the Egypt area. And they've just discovered that not too long ago, maybe a couple of years ago, if not this year, that there actually was a tributary, a river that was there at one time. So that map had that information on it. It has the Laurentide ice sheet that's over Alaska on the North American continent. How did they know that? This is 1513. It shows South America. They didn't discover South America until, I think, 1841. Or not South America, I mean Antarctica. And since they didn't discover that continent until the 1800s. So how did they know about that in 1513? That was just when 1513, if you think about it. Let's see, Columbus had just discovered America in 1492. So we have 1513, that's not that many years, and all of a sudden you have this map that shows all this stuff. There's no way that they could have had that many ships go that far and map that much, that accurately. So it's just a fascinating map, just an absolutely beautiful, fascinating map. And there's a lot of them like that. I mean, there's maps that you look at and you wonder. There's a missing map of Columbus. So everyone thinks that he probably had a map that showed the New World, which he thought was India, but that's why he happily went the direction he did go and thought he had found it. That's not been discovered, or maybe it's been misidentified, kind of like the map that I found that said Gulf Streams on it, that instead probably shows, that's Happel's map of 1630. It probably shows trade routes because it doesn't show any currents in places that I would have thought they would have had Gulf Stream currents. So it's just interesting, these maps. But the Piri Reis, I think, is probably the most beautiful example of something put together from a bunch of different pieces that where they got the information from, I just don't know, but it's a beautiful map.
Yeah, and you have in your article that the geosensing through today's ice sheets corresponds with the
outline and the
shorelines of Antarctica from the early 16th century when it was drawn.
Yes, and that was a lot of that was from Hapgood's work, but then even later work to look at that shoreline, and it maps beautifully to what is actually there, still under ice. So I think we have to look back at history, and I think we have to research and read and keep looking, because there's a lot of pieces that we just haven't found yet.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Charles Hapgood's book, the Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. I haven't read. I'm just just have a general idea of what it's about. But it's that book seems like it's may have been originally seen at its publication as it's a little out there kind of book, but what 50, 60 years later, people are actually taking note of the research presented in Hapgood's book. What seems to really be attracting scholars to go back to his work?
Well, Hapgood wrote more than just the Map of the Sea Kings. He also wrote a book, which I don't think was well received, on the Path of the Poles, where he talked about, he had a theory of crustal displacement and that kind of thing. But the Map of the Sea Kings, he actually is probably what was put together in that book is probably the expert on all the ancient maps that we have historical knowledge of. A beautiful piece of work. I mean, he covered, and his students covered a tremendous amount of volume or body of work in that particular book. And it's, I'm just going back here with some of the illustrations that he had in the that he had from the Piri Reis Map. His source recognition of the coastlines and stuff, I just don't think that this was. I think they had to have a fairly sophisticated mapping technique to be able to done the shorelines the way they were done in the Piri Reis Map, and that's what Hapgood talks about. And we don't know how they did it. We just don't know how they did it.
Yeah.
And the other comment is notation on one of the maps. There's no trace of any sort of agriculture or cultivation in this country. Everything's desolate, and big snakes are there. They describe the coastline, which of eastern South America, as being totally desolate. No agriculture, no nothing. Desolate, no people, nothing. Big X. And yet there's ruins and there's remnants and everything there. So I don't know I do not know where all the pieces came for that map, but I'm sure that it had something to do with some of the seafaring groups. Maybe the Egyptians, probably some Egyptians, probably pre-Egyptian, probably our beaker traders, probably any of the seafarers that we have followed or have history of or knowledge of from the past, helped build that map for that 1513 map. There must have been some tremendous information in those libraries that were burnt up in Alexandria and whatnot all those years ago.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's that ancient technology that it still amazes us today. That we're just finding out about it, but it's just something that was lost, and we're just rediscovering it. And you just really have to marvel at how bright these people were.
I think that humans are bright, as long as we're allowed to be bright. But I don't know that we've changed that much, but we may have been learning from a younger age and been able to read and retain information rather than just have oral histories. I think that's been a big difference, so that we could more easily share information. But people I'm looking at an agricultural system in the Altiplano that we could not create today. And I'm looking at maps that I don't know how they created those maps with what we think they had the ability to do back in those times. I do not know how they did it. I don't know how we would do it now if we didn't have some sort of satellite technology, GPS systems and whatnot. So how did they get that accuracy that long ago? And how come it looks like it went from really, really good mapping and technology from from 1513, and it really went downhill pretty badly, and they didn't know lats and longs, how latitudes and how to map the longitude and latitude, how to map that until the 1800s, in middle 1800s. So we're talking a map that was 300 years before anyone even knew how to map the terrain of the Earth correctly. And even now, I don't know we do it right, but how did they do that?
Yeah, your friend Jay Wakefield has really made a name for himself by positing some theories about ancient sailing and navigation. He thinks that some of the artifacts do correspond with an understanding of the use of latitude and longitude to get from the old world to the Americas. He has quite a few articles on that in Ancient American Magazine.
Yes.
Yeah, in his
Rocks and
book,
Rose.
Rocks and Rose. I'm more familiar with paddle boats. Can you bring your expertise of actually sailing these waters and explaining how his theories actually do help to explain that the ancient naval engineers could pull this off?
I don't think there's any question that ancient engineers could pull it off, because we've taken a sailboat with 350 gallons of fuel in it, and we've gone across the Atlantic, North Atlantic, to Europe on that boat, with just about 6 people on it sometimes not that, sometimes just our 2 kids and us. And we've gone into the Med, and we've gone to the Cape Verdes, and we've gone from Africa, Cape Verdes, south, and gone to Antigua, and then down to Venezuela, and up. We've gone all over the Caribbean. The Caribbean is just easy sailing, but there is no. Once you start sailing the currents in the Atlantic and the winds, they take you from west to east in the north part, and they take you from east to west in the southern part of the Atlantic. That's the way it works. Then you get to the equator, and it works the other way. And the currents go the same and encourage the circular flow in both. You've got the North Atlantic and you've got the South Atlantic, and you've got a circular current flow in both of them. You've got a wind flow in both of them. And so you could put a boat will end up in the North Sea. It will end up near Europe by just being in a current. And I think that Jay has looked at a lot of the diagrams and the rock carvings in Malta and in some of the other areas of Europe, and some of the megaliths or the monuments that are there, and has been able to map out, or at least make a relationship between that and how seafarers would tell a story to somebody else that was in their group. Now, I think that the ocean navigators at that point in time probably used stone, maybe metal, but probably stone. That would last better than anything else in a saltwater environment, which is what you're in. And they probably had little cheat sheets of stone, which is what Jay has found. He's found the stones that have markers, or their shapes with markers. There's big stones with markers, and they seem to be related to each other. So I think he's got a very interesting theory, and it maps out. You can see. I can understand what he's talking about, and we've sailed it, and we've ended up where we were supposed to end up. And we started sailing back in the 1980s and 90s. GPS was new. That was really the new thing. So you just, you went out, you mapped yourself every day where you were going, and kind of figured out where you were. And we have a sextant, and you used that and figured out where the sun was and stuff. And you were able to get from point A to point B. It's not elegant. It's not easy, but you end up on the other side of the ocean eventually. So I think that's what Jay is seeing in some of these figures and stuff, and it seems to me to be very reasonable. When I look at how he's laid this out, it's a very reasonable theory. I can understand it. I can see how it might work. And then I see patterns that he has seen in these, like a zigzag pattern. I can kind of look at that and go, well, I wonder if that meant that zigzag canal there. Or you see something with a circle on it, you kind of wonder, well, I wonder if that meant there. Or, but we can't prove it. It's a theory. But I think it's as good as anything when you see what he's theorizing. They did that for a reason. They didn't do it just for fun. Chipping away at rock is not something you do just for the fun of it. That was a method of communication. We've lost the dictionaries. We've lost the translation code to map it to our stuff, but it meant something, and I think it's as logical as anything, because I think the most important thing back then was trade, getting product from one place to another, and they use sea routes.
Since we've been looking at the facts, there were transatlantic and transpacific crossings, way back in time. And I think Greg and Andrew made that very clear just with the DNA testing. Mm-hmm. But Brian Forster has made a name for himself on ancient aliens, as well as his tours and of South American locations, his numerous books on the ancient peoples of South America. But he's looked at these on ancient aliens. On TV talking about these elongated skulls.
The Paracas skulls. Elongated skulls.
That's it.
It wasn't just the Paracas that had the larger heads. We find up in the Americas, they talk about the large-headed skulls that they have found. They found in a mound in Vermilion Parish in the Mississippi Delta, next to the Morgan Mound. They found skeletons with the elongated heads there. They found an effigy that shows a person with an elongated head that was buried in the Morgan Mound, and that was documented by Harvard. It wasn't the Paracas themselves had elongated heads, but I think they were spread out more than just in the Paracas area. I do know that I talked about that one area where there was the indigo dye and the cotton fabric that was Egyptian cotton was finer Egyptian cotton than they found in Egypt. They found a skull there that was an enlarged skull, elongated skull. But they didn't talk much about it. They don't talk much about people when they find these elongated skulls. They found them in some of the mounds up in the Mississippi and north, up into for the mound builders. They occasionally will find the large person with a large skull. In the Altiplano, in some of the canals, they've carved into those canals or made pictures of. There's people, I think men or a representation of a human, but they have the elongated skull. Their hands are up to the sky praying, and they have the elongated skull. And I think Brian has done absolutely beautiful work detailing and showing these skulls that are, I mean, this was a different type of person. This was not the kind of skull that we have. And something no one's talked about is how in the world did a woman deliver a baby with an elongated skull like that? Was there something special in that skull? Is the skull thinner than our skulls are? I have never heard that discussed by anyone, but I just can't figure out how, if you had a baby with a head like that, how it could be delivered by a normal human that we are now. It would be almost impossible unless that skull was different.
Yeah, that was, when you were talking about, is this a different person? That was where I was hoping you'd go with the discussion. That's really interesting because when if we go back earlier into the show, I mentioned when we were covering the Book of Mormon, you get some of this information that kind of sound like maybe the ancestors of the Adena were coming up from South America, and then the Hopewell were
right.
Yeah, show up a little bit later in time, and you're talking about these different skull shapes, and different people. Are we talking about? Did people look different prior to this cataclysmic event in South America? Are we dealing with almost like two different species of humans?
I don't know without doing DNA testing, although I think Brian has done it, how you could tell what the relationship was. We just don't have enough information. But I wonder when you hear of Inca royal women had to have their babies by C-section. Why?
No, the head. You get the head out.
Yeah, and you kind of wonder. You just wonder how a Paracas head, an enlarged head, they couldn't have. I mean, how were they birthed? And that's not something that that is kind of a showstopper for continuation of a human line or genetics. If you can't birth somebody, it's kind of like O negative blood that we have. RH negative blood. A woman can have maybe one baby, from an Rh positive person, but after that she doesn't have any, and that's kind of like also a stopping point for it's not really something that doesn't encourage a lot of kids in a family. If you've got a woman with O negative blood and there's the husband has O positive or Rh positive blood. So where did that come from? It's kind of an interesting thing, like the Paracas skull. You could not have an enlarged skull with birth easily. So is it a different human? I don't know. Is the DNA different? I don't know. But, we just found the hobbits. They now found those little miniature humans, the hobbits in, was it Borneo or Java, where they thought they were just stories of that race, but actually it was a little tiny human. So that there a possibility that the Paracas are a different variant of human? Yes. Do we know that? No. But just looking at the skull alone, I would think you're going to have problems with a Homo sapiens, as we know them, having a baby with a skull like that. So, I don't know. Many types of humans, I guess it's possible, but we just don't have we don't have the knowledge yet to say for sure. I think the research is still being done.
Yeah, I don't have explanations, and I don't know if there were more different types of humans than previously thought. I don't think evolution explains everything. There's just I think throughout this show
there's a lot of things we don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know.
I think that's one of the nice things about having you on is maybe we didn't get a lot of answers, and that's actually a good thing because we're talking about what we need to research in the future, and you've presented a lot of information that we just don't understand yet, and a lot of it. Some of these questions are clouded because of trade, the migrations of people.
The lack of ability to communicate, or the lack of our ability to understand how they used to communicate, like the Ronku writings from Easter Island. They may be all kinds of ways to communicate. What if those geoglyphs in the ground, which you can see from up above, maybe that was a way of communicating. Maybe we just don't understand what they were telling us. Carvings on rocks, like Jay is explaining with the rocks and rows and trying to describe that. That's a communications technique. We don't know the language. He's trying to decipher that language. The canals themselves up in the Altiplano, no one has really seen those big circular canals. I mean, it's just, I had a friend from a research group say, "Where did you find those canals?" And I said, "Well, they're there." She said, "But nobody's seen them. They're there. And you can go find them. You can go see them. You can go to Google Earth and go look at near Lake Titicaca, and you can find these beautiful circular canals. You just got to know how to look for them. And they're all over. And the foundations are all over, and the terraces are all over. And it's perfectly legit to go look because they're absolutely gorgeous."
Well, I think that's one of the points that all of us will come away from, your lecture tonight is go out and look for this information, try to connect the dots that you started us on, as well as Jay Wakefield and his navigational theories, and all the other researchers that Brian Forrester's Paracas skulls. You brought up several of these influential researchers and all the other our colleagues in Ancient American Magazine, and we just we don't have all the answers. We just try to put our observations out there, and
and that's
we need
one thing
someone
Brian
to carry.
Forrester has done. Yeah.
Because
Brian's done that.
Yeah, and we can just get the next generation to
Well, I really would like someone to go look
piece.
at those canals, and look at those canals in the Alto Plano. Look at the designs. Fly LiDAR. Pull more of the dirt off, because there's tons of more designs underneath the layer of this 9 meters of this red soil that's flooded over the top of them. There's docks down there. There's dockyards in the dry areas now, but there was water and they had docks. They had just an amazing infrastructure, and it's just all just kind of, it's there. It's under the dirt, rocks, everything under the dirt. But those canals are so beautiful, and how they did it, I don't know.
We're down to like 8 minutes left. Is the Piri Reis Map on display somewhere, or do we know where it's curated?
No, we don't. I know that I find a lot of maps. NOAA has archives that you can actually go to Washington D.C. and go to some of the archives and the Smithsonian stuff and find maps. The Piri Reis Map, I don't know where it's at. That's a very good question. Physically, where the maps done by the Admiral are. I would assume probably in maybe Turkey, but I don't know. He was in the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
That was a long time.
I don't know. I was just that's just another thing piece of the puzzle that we need to find over time. That's what I really enjoyed about tonight's show, is you just got us thinking. I really enjoyed it, and we have like 7 minutes or so. What is there any upcoming event, publication, something you would like to draw the listeners' attention to?
Well, I think if you there are a lot of interesting online, like academia.org.u and ResearchGate.
.edu.
Yeah, ResearchGate, where researchers publish a lot of their key papers, and I collect anything on Andes mining, because I think the mining industry, both in both Americas, but in the Andes, it's extremely interesting to me, and any of the research that they're doing on pre-Inca time frame. It can be from mining, it can be from pottery, it can be from Nazca lines, it can be whatever. I just have that come to me as a tickler from, you subscribe to what you want from these different research sites. That's a wonderful way to start getting information. You just got to be willing to read a lot. I put some of my documents out there early before I finalize something, and I really have enjoyed using Ancient American as a venue because my background is not in archaeology. I'm a computer scientist and I've worked with satellite imagery and processing and identifying terrains and that kind of thing. I have a background in agriculture because I had a farm, and I have understand growing crops. I understand irrigation, plants, meristem tissue culture, that kind of thing. So when I see these irrigation systems and the agriculture, I know the requirements for doing the irrigation, the agriculture, and whatnot. It's something that I'm familiar with. That is an area that I have expertise in. So between the computer science research areas and the agriculture and sailing, because we do that, it's really allowed me to look at these different prehistory sites with maybe a slightly different focus.
Is objective the right word? I think you just presented a balanced overview of this subject. I thought it was terrific, and even if we didn't answer every question tonight, people have something to think about, and maybe they will be the next ones who make the next important discovery that connects one more dot.
Well, I just hope that someone goes and looks and tries to think about why an entire mountain range would drop 1,000 foot and lakes would flood out of their boundaries and flood over populated areas. Mountains would rise up. What would cause all that in a time when humans were there? So what caused that kind of catastrophe? That at the end of the last ice age, likely. Can we prove it that? Probably not. But looking at all these pieces, looking at these canals, looking at the technologies, looking at the areas that you can see these remnants in, it just points out that there's a lot more to find out about these different peoples that may now not be, it's an extinct, maybe it's an extinct civilization that was there. Who knows? But there is some evidence there still, and we should find it. We should look for it. We should figure out what happened, because it could happen again.
Yep, I agree. And how about if there's not a cataclysm in the next few months, we have you come back and talk about this some more. This was a terrific show, and you're welcome to return. It was fascinating.
Thank you very much.
And
I think we
Barbara,
covered a lot of areas.
Oh yeah. And, we'll just have to do it again. Barbara, do you want to come in and wrap it up?
I would be happy to. I want to thank everybody for sticking with us, because the show has absolutely been fascinating. Please remember to tune in to us tomorrow night, and again next Monday and Tuesday. We look forward to it. We thank all of you for being with us, and have a great evening. And if you're listening in archive, thanks so much for checking up on the new stuff that's on the show every week.